Hi everybody, my name is Jim Diamond. I'm from the Education Development Center here in New York City, just over in the West Village. And I'm here with my colleagues David Langdon from Electric Fun Stuff and Leah Potter from the American Social History Project at the City University of New York. And we are here today, as you can see, to talk about badges. So our presentation is entitled There's a Badge for That. And just before we dive into badges, a little bit of background as to our sort of federal connection here. The game that we're going to be talking about this afternoon is entitled Mission US. It's part of a larger series of games that was developed through the American History and Civics Initiative, which was funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And produced by Channel 13, WNET, here in New York City, with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, among others. So thank you to Michael Shirley for teeing this project up in the previous presentation, because we're going to be talking a bit more specifically today about badges in Mission US. The American History and Civics Initiative started about 7 or 8 years ago. And it was a large-scale project through CPB to fund public television partnerships with new media and technology developers for middle and high school social studies and history education. So the idea was to use new technologies and integrate new technologies into history and social studies education. Over the years, CPB funded a fairly large number of projects. And at the end, there were 4 projects remaining that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting funded all the way through. My organization, the Education Development Center, is the evaluation partner on that. So later this year, we'll be coming out with the final evaluation report on those final 4 projects, of which Mission US is one. So that is our connection with the federal government, or partly our connection with the federal government. So to get started, we want to focus today mostly on the process of design that went into the badge system for Game 2. So as I mentioned, there are going to be 4 games. The 3rd game is under development right now. The first game was entitled For Crown or Colony. Students played the role of a 14-year-old printer's apprentice in colonial Boston. It's an adventure game with role-playing elements. And we piloted that game in a number of classrooms across the country with several thousand students and probably about 24 teachers or so. And based on the findings from those pilot studies, going into Game 2, the project decided to integrate a badging system. And one of the pieces we'd like to focus on today is the distinction between badges for gamification or rewards and badges that seem to be more tightly integrated with learning objectives. And in this process, on this project, we were very interested in trying to align badges with learning objectives. So I just quickly want to point out, I'm not going to go through all these circles, but part of the role that I've played on this project is as a formative researcher. So as ideas are created, as designs go out iteratively, we go out into classrooms and talk with teachers and students and engage in formative testing with the work that we have. So to understand, one, classroom teachers' needs for the specific technology, right? So classroom teachers' needs will vary across technology. A game is not the same as PowerPoint, it's not the same as a smartboard. So trying to understand more about how teachers use games and what they need them for. Understanding more about student misconceptions. So where do middle school and early high school age children come from when they enter a space about American history, and in this case specifically related to the topic of enslaved people in the American South. So what are their preconceived notions? What are their ideas about who slaves were, what they did, what their lives were like? What are their ideas about what slaveholders were like? And the final piece is coming at it with an understanding of learners' objectives in this kind of a space. So again, a learner will come to a space with a certain set of objectives, and given that it's a game, we're also giving them agency, right? So learners will come to a game not only as students, but as game players. So in formative research, we also try to understand, where is your objective as a player meeting your objective as a student, right? Provided you have any explicitly stated. But certainly players have agency and they have objectives coming to games, and we try to learn more about that. And that's really just what this entire image up here is trying to say, is that starting by identifying misconceptions and teachers' needs, working through multiple iterations of game design, and then finally coming out with a final badge system that exists in Game 2. David and Leah are going to talk in a lot more specific terms. I apologize if that was a bit in the abstract. But just quickly about the process that has evolved over time in this team, and it's been a partnership of game designers, historians, producers, and education researchers. The process that has really evolved is starting with what are, a statement of the intended learning outcomes. So social historians have ideas about what they would like to have children learning in the classroom and how they might like to have classroom teachers work with that material. As researchers, we then go in and talk with teachers and students. And again, we sort of hear what their thinking is. So there's an example here. In the first game about colonial Boston, we spoke with a bunch of students, and it turns out that many, many students sort of feel that people are born patriots out of the womb around the time of the Revolutionary War, that everybody wanted independence from England. It was just, without question, everybody hated the king and they wanted to get away. Well, it turns out that social historians have different ideas, right? And it's probably a more complex picture than that. So what happened was we're able to bring those findings back to work with the developers and the historians, then to think more about how design can engage those misconceptions. And I hesitate to call them misunderstandings, because I don't think that's what they are necessarily. But to think about how those misconceptions might inform a player's agency. What do I think this world was about? And therefore, how am I going to move? And then, what do I want to do? And how am I going to move? Right? So I am going to turn it over to David. Are you going to stay there, David?
Yeah, I'll try. Okay, mic is on. Hi, I'm David Langdon. I'm the lead game designer on this project. And so in this previous problem, how do we deal with the idea that there are loyalists, there are patriots, and there are people who are sort of in between or just ducking their head and trying to avoid the whole situation? And then how do we deal with the misconceptions, for example, that everyone is a patriot? So this actually shows our solution, but let me back up some of the thinking. Most game designers will think, you look at a problem like this, the first thing you kind of go to is there a point system for that? Can they earn patriot points and loyalist points, and does that make sense, and does that show the progression? And the great thing about point systems as well, they're easy to program and everyone understands them. Like, we've all played video games, points make sense. But in a context like this, they're really quite problematic because points are more points are generally better. So the idea is, if I've got more revolutionary points, it gives the idea that being more radical is better. Or if I'm being more loyalist, it gives me the idea that being a staunch loyalist is a better position than otherwise. So, I mean, and that's the kind of thing that come with points. Or if you're trying to do like a balance thing where loyalist points negate patriot points, so neutral is you do really radical actions over here and really loyalist actions over here, you're therefore neutral. And that it's a broken model for that case. We didn't come to badges here, and we'll do that in the next mission, but we probably, if we had had the time and the development effort at that point, we might have come to some similar conclusions. But what we did here is, knowing that kids were sort of skeptical of loyalists and didn't really, want to talk to them even per se in the games in our early testing, we kind of took some editorial conceits here. So we made this character here you're seeing here, Constance. She's the 16-year-old daughter of an actual Boston merchant, Theophilus Lilly, and who was quite a loyalist himself. And so Constance sort of represents that voice, but she's sort of an attractive voice. She's a girl who's just lost her dog. And this is a sort of an editorial conceit that really helped get kids engaged with her, because they could first talk about the dog. They're a printer's apprentice. They could sell her an advertisement about getting her dog back, which actually was pulled from the real Boston Gazette paper. There was an advertisement for a lost dog, so this is well researched. And so what Constance gave us was the ability to help kids engage further with this problem and listen to the loyalist point of view with an open ear, and it was sort of carefully embedded into the overall flow. And it worked. By the end of the game, from our post-testing, we've done about a third of kids sort of actually sided with the loyalists. They actually thought, going off of, there was an ending that goes off of Constance, and they felt that, the loyalists had some really good points here. So this was just one example of how to solve a design problem, and now we'll move on to badges. Oh.
Hi, I'm Leah. As a social historian, my primary concern is with the content development of this project and helping to define the learning objectives. And for Mission 2, Flight to Freedom, we were concerned with the topic of slavery and the Underground Railroad and abolition. And we were less concerned about trying to impart a set of facts or information about slavery, but really trying to understand it from the perspective of an enslaved person and the idea of resistance and community. And this really reflects about 100 years or so of changing scholarship about slavery. So if we were in a room in 1912 and learning about slavery, we would have been hearing about what was done for slaves. So kind of a notion of benevolent paternalism. And here maybe the metaphor for slavery might have been slavery or the plantation as a school, where masters taught their slaves. And critics since then have pointed out that one of the problems with this particular metaphor was that none of the students were ever allowed to graduate. So that eventually changed, and by the 1950s, you have a very different notion of slavery as what was done to the slaves, against the slaves. And here maybe the metaphor for the plantation would have been a concentration camp, which in the 1950s would have been a very meaningful metaphor. And starting about maybe 30 years ago, there started to be a pushback. Instead of what was done for the slaves or what was done to the slaves, the question was, well, what did slaves do for themselves? And really, it was a contribution of social historians who introduced this notion of slave agency. And so that was the big framing idea that we were really concerned with. And this was a kind of behind the big house look at the plantation and trying to get a sense of the complexity of that space and agency within a very constrained circumstance, which is an interesting problem for historians to try and sort through, and we wanted students to have an opportunity to do that as well. And then our other big goal in terms of learning objectives was the historical thinking concept of cause and effect. And so as historians, we're interested in helping students understand that there are multiple causes to events, and sort of trying to break down this notion of a single causality framework, and so getting them to wrestle with multiple causes, and then also a sense that effects are both immediate and sometimes very obvious, but then some effects take a while to manifest themselves and really are only revealed over time. So that's what we brought to the team and said, these are the things that we think are important that happen in Mission 2. And as educators, we were really curious about, well, what do students already think about these things, particularly agency when it came to the topic of slavery. And so Jim and his team went into schools with a set of formative research questions. And they asked students to think about, what can a slave do? And it turns out that students tended to think in extremes. So either seeing all slaves as Nat Turners, as fully empowered, active, agents of their own liberation, without necessarily being aware of the consequences, by the way, of being a Nat Turner, or thinking in terms of slaves as victims and having no power whatsoever. When it came to being able to identify with the topic, a lot of students would say, well, if I were enslaved, I would have run away. And again, thinking that that's what they would have done without sort of understanding the constraints. Why would someone not choose to run away? What might be the consequences immediately in the long term if they did? So our goal was really to turn things over to David and his design team to try and come up with a set of game encounters and game mechanics that would support a richer, deeper understanding of agency in this very particular historic context.
So this is where the badges came in. We thought about freedom points for about 5 minutes, but that really had some problems. We thought more about embedded embodied characters who represent a point of view. So one slave who might just be like keeping his or her head down and just doing the work, and someone else who's really concerned about their family, and someone else who is actually either committing acts of passive or active resistance or sabotage. But introducing all those characters and trying to have those conversations started creating a very stilted feel to the game, like, now talk to this person and let them tell you about their opinion. And to make these games feel genuine and engaging to the kids, the narrative really has to be there, and you can't just have them go off and talk to talking heads who are just going to spit opinions at you. So there is some of that in here where we could naturally embed those moments in conversation to talk about different slave perspectives and the kinds of resistance or kinds of actions or not actions that they were engaged in is part of it. But what really felt right to us in the end was creating a badge system, because when we're trying to think about how do we get kids to understand that if they are slow in their work, that is a form of resistance, that if they're collecting the eggs and they decide to break some or steal some, those are different, more aggressive forms of resistance or sabotaging. And so this general notion of communicating to the player when they take acts of resistance that they're actually doing that, and to give them some more context about it, about what the possible ramifications of that are. The badges, or we have the lead badge in the thing, the breaking the change is our resistance badge. And then in other cases, though, but playing it safe, as we call it, is also a very acceptable way to be, or really trying to protect your own family and making decisions around that are all acceptable ways to, or ways that slaves actually did deal with their slavery. And we wanted to have badges representing those different choices, and some of them are mutually exclusive, and we're not trying to cast judgments here that it's better to resist than to play it safe or protect your family or any of these things, but just that the character's name is Lucy, and that the Lucy you create, and this goes to Jim G's kind of theories about avatar player and the player avatar, is your creation, and that the choices you make for your Lucy are going to be different from someone else's, and that the long-term cause and effect of those decisions, which we'll get to in a second, are embedded throughout the game and sort of how the game unfolds. So the badge system is what it was. Jim's team really was very helpful early on. We found out, first thing that kind of surprised us is, because I'm a gamer, and most gamers who are transgressive players, they will muck around with the system, they'll push it to its limits, they'll try to screw around, cause trouble, see what the designer did for that, if you tried this. What we found is, in the context of school, even the most, what I would consider transgressive gamer, which is probably a 10 to 12-year-old boy, is not. These kids, and I don't want to make a commentary about schools and kids being very obedient, but they tended to think that it was their teacher or the school would want them to follow what the overseer in the game was saying and doing, because that was being, quote, good, and you're supposed to be good and behaved in school. So that was one early interesting challenge. We hit some lack of connection between action and badges, and again, this is a simple interface design issue. How do you, when you take an action, initially we had you just kind of had a subtle message and a badge was being earned, and it just wasn't quite, kids would get the badge later and say, where did that come from? So we had to deal with that. And we also felt, and this is coming from us more the designers than anything else, that the badges had to have meaning, purpose. A lot of times in gamification, the purpose of the badge is to get the badge, and maybe to show it off to your friends, or in your Xbox list, they can see all your stuff, and that you got your quad headshot with one bullet. And that's cool, and badges are great for helping show you the possibility space of a game, and badges recognize that you've worked through those possibilities. But we felt, especially to this cause and effect point, that earning badges had to have real in-game impact for the player to actually be meaningful, and also to drive replay to see if they did a different set of badges, what that might mean for the options. So that graphic in the lower down, that you got the resistance badge, that was just our first way of like, that's one of the first badges you can get, and we just splash it in your face. And we also wanted to get across the idea you acted against Master King. By working slowly, disobeying orders, or destroying his property, you were fighting or resisting slavery. Will he find out? Will you get punished? Will you resist more? These are the kinds of questions we want kids to be thinking about here. So we were just actually got quite literal about it and sort of stepped out of the game and give these thoughtful questions to kids to evaluate their actions, be able to think about them more. And if they keep resisting and keep those actions, there are other badges that unfold from that. And if they sort of pull back and back off, it goes a different direction. And the other screenshot just shows that there are some you earn and some you don't earn. And again, it's about this feedback of being very clear, especially to kids, that how did you get something? Why did you get something? What did you get? What did you not get? That's all information they should have. Speaking to that sort of ultimate purpose, so we came up with this idea of an epilogue that covers the last 10 years of the player's life. And it's a little bit of a choose your own adventure story. But what happens is, this is a spoiler alert, at the end of Mission US Lucy, even though she did escape, there's a whole escape sequence, there's living life in the north and the dangers there, that there are still slave catchers and bounty hunters running around up there, and telling the whole story of quote unquote freedom in the north and what it meant to be an escaped slave there. Eventually, no matter what you do, you get recaptured. And we wanted to do this kind of as a shock to the kids, that this idea that yes, you escaped, hurrah, that was great, but it isn't over yet. And it's not always safe, and that this wasn't the promised land, even when you were, quote, free, and even if all the abolitionists are on your side. So Lucy, in fact, does get recaptured, but we enter this what we call the epilogue, where the player is making choices for Lucy to tell what happens. And some choices are always available to the player, and you can see down here, Lucy is sold to a plantation in the south, Lucy is sold to a farm in the west. You can always choose to let yourself be sold, or if you've earned one of these other two badges, that M there's a character named Millie, and she's an Eastern abolitionist, and if you have taken action throughout the game to demonstrate that she likes, like studying your reading, becoming a better reader, talking about slavery and your condition, and being open and honest with her about a bunch of things, she actually grows fond of you. So we have sort of these under the hood personality meters going on, where so if Millie likes you, you get the Millie's Ally badge. And if John Parker, who actually is a historical figure, likes you through different kinds of things you say and do, you get the Parker's Ally badge. And either of these, and most kids usually get one of these, most don't get both, but you get one or the other usually. Some don't get either, in which case that's the cause and effect. You did not use your opportunities free in the north to actually make the kind of social relationships and networks that are going to enable you to get out of this particular situation easily. So in this case, John Parker, if I play this badge, he's actually going to rescue me. So we'll see. Come here. Mr. Parker took my capture as a personal challenge. With a small posse, he was able to wrest me from the man who bought me and escort me back to Ohio, but I was still in danger of being recaptured. Unfortunately, Jonah, the player's brother, who you also worked to rescue in the game, was sold to someone else, and Mr. Parker was not able to rescue him. There are other choices in the game that let you actually save Jonah before he's captured. This one happens to be one of the sadder stories. But these badges, so if I have the resistance badge, that's going to let me join the Underground Railroad and actually work my way. I could possibly work my way up to being a conductor there, or just help out moving things around or scouting out safe houses. The persuasion badge lets me do something else. I can talk myself into a different kind of direction or position. And there's this Parker's Promise badge, where if in the game John Parker really liked me, he will act, and I've kind of shown an affinity for physical action, if you will, and an interest in guns, as this particular one is. You can actually get a more direct route into the Underground Railroad. But there's 24 unique endings, from writing your own book to giving speeches in Boston, to ending up a slave in Kentucky, to being rescued by somebody else or escaping at a different time, moving to Canada, getting married, having kids. It's all in there. And badges let us do that. So the player I make, through the actions I take, the badges are linked to specific learning objectives and understandings, and then we kind of tie the whole cause and effect to this end moment and bring that together. Now, this is a pretty, oh, could you jump to the next? Early, this is what I would consider a system in transition. This is trying to get to the idea that, you know, there's a holy grail in gaming and education of this idea of in-game assessment, that somehow the game can, through my play and through my choices, figure out what I know. That would sort of be the, you know, one of these things that a lot of people would like to see. It's very, very, very difficult to do well. And we certainly don't see this system as an embodiment of that. It's maybe a step forward in that direction. But one of the real challenges to that point is that what reward systems you put into the game, be it points, be it badges, be it cool characters or things to do or talk about, subtly or not so subtly influence player action. The rewards you put in are the things that your players are going to do. So if your rewards are not very well aligned with your learning objectives, you can just have unintended consequences of what kids do, or you could think they learned something but they didn't because they were just motivated by a point system and not really paying attention to actually what was going on. So, but hopefully iterations of this kind of design and development will help point us to a clearer path of that. So for Mission 3, which is about the Northern Cheyenne Indians during westward expansion, but told from the point of view of the Cheyenne. And I thought, actually I thought slavery was going to be, when they said, let's make slavery into a game, it's a challenge, and it really was, because it's dark, and it's tough issues. And I have to say, though, wait till next spring when we tell the story of the Indians, the Plains Indians, and the American expansion out west, and it tops this in terms of toughness. But anyway, what we'd like to see for Mission 3 is more in-game effects for badges. Right now it's mostly in that epilogue, and so you earn these badges, but there's not a lot that happens in between the moment of earning it and that ending. There's a couple moments. There's a literacy badge when you read, and we have this actually pretty cool system of primary source documents, because Lucy was a slave and she really can't read to start the game. So when she comes across these documents, we kind of dynamically blur out the text based on the players, what we decide is their reading level. And they can take actions throughout the game to increase that level, and earning those badges are symbolic of that, and the text actually becomes clearer and clearer to them as they play the game. So we'd like to do more kinds of things like that in Mission 3, including special dialogue options that would open up. So like that epilogue, instead you'd be talking to a character, but if you had the persuasion badge right there, you might be able to convince someone in an in-game dialogue right then and there to do something. That's fairly common in role-playing games as well, but we want to see more of that kind of direct cause and effect. Teachers can see badges that students earn. We hope that we can do a little more on reporting, and this again, it's not a perfect analog, and I'm a little worried that teachers will take it as you've assessed them to know X, Y, and Z because they did this, but hopefully we can push that a little further towards big ideas that certain students have been exposed to or actions they took and others. And then we think it's a good opportunity for writing prompts. Again, in-class activities and materials. I can't tell you how important that has been and the work that Leah and Jim have done and other educators, wrapping up, to make this a holistic class experience. This is not just a game you play. This is something that is actually, we didn't get a chance to talk about implementation, but something that unfolds throughout. And the materials are fantastic, and we love writing prompts. We have to move along. Do you want to talk on this last one, Jim?
So just 1 minute to wrap up. I know we're running a little bit over time, but I just want to make one point before concluding, which is that these games were designed as classroom games. They can be played at home as well, but they were designed for classrooms. There was no attempt by this project to bypass school teachers. In fact, there's an entire set of accompanying classroom activities and materials with these games, and I think that's very important to note, because I think very often we can assume that gameplay in and of itself is evidence of learning, and I don't think we can make those assumptions yet. A lot of games don't allow for reflection. A lot of games don't allow for application of new learning. And what we can do is build supports in the classroom to help teachers capitalize on in-game events, including badges, right? So this particular game has an entire set of activities associated with badges to help learners understand more about the meaning of those badges. So I just think that's important for this specific project to keep in mind. And then I would just say, in conclusion, badges as markers of learning, and even more broadly, games, context matters, right? And I think that's sort of what I was, saying from the beginning, that I think as developers, we have to have a better understanding of where our learners are coming from, where teachers are coming from, what abilities learners bring to games and badges to make sense of the meaning that badges have. It's entirely possible that learners are taking away meanings that we never intended. In fact, it's entirely likely that that's the case.
We should just put in the plug for the Open Badge Initiative. If you're not familiar with it and you're interested in badges, there's a big initiative going on through Mozilla to create a universal badging system tying to all manner of learning and education, and they're really trying to push the idea that informal learning is a valid form of learning, and that these badge systems will hopefully eventually grow to be sort of an accreditation of that and an acknowledgement from experts and the community at large around that. So Open Badge Initiative is a good place to look if you're thinking about trying to hook into a badge system about building your own.
Cool. You gotta get off right now, or is there one question?
Okay, quick question.
Quick question? Or we're here.
Up in the back.
Sure, in 1088, guilds got together in Bologna to make what in effect was the first university as a way to build an accreditation system for that day's workers. Is the badge system a way to replace universities?
So the condensed version is the badge system possibly a way to replace universities? And I suspect you're probably talking more about this Mozilla Open Badge Initiative than the game. We need a lot more time to answer that question. I think the short answer is no. That's my opinion. I think it can supplement universities and formal systems of learning, and I think there are certainly people that are interested in looking at badging systems as they would guild systems and apprenticeships. That's a hideously short answer to a very complex
You
question.
could imagine badges significantly supplementing a standard grading system and movement through a curriculum and markers of progress through that are a little different than getting an A or a B.
Maybe.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.